And I just want to ask you, like, I was unfamiliar with the story, but it was such a powerful story. But getting these guys to share their story 50 years later, was that painful for them? And then also just working with an HBCU, which tends to be underfunded and don't get as much attention as, the other universities. What was that whole experience like?
Yeah. Let me answer the easier question first, which was working with an HBCU like South Carolina State, who's not incredibly well funded. And it was a little hard getting people on the phone and talking. You call, for any of us who've done work with a college football program, I mean, you call the SIU, the sports information or SIO sports information office, and they're sometimes run as good as pro teams with all of their organization. And these days, an HBCU is struggling for funding and staffing and all of that. So it was a little tough tracking everything down. That's why I went out there, because I realized that if for me to really track this down, I'm going to have to go out there. And that's when I met some of the most amazing guys I've ever met in my life, who were.
Now, real quickly, Jim, let me just interrupt our listeners and filmmakers out there. Did you just show up on the 50th anniversary with cameras, or how did you kind of get your entryway into their trust or credentials or whatever it takes to come down there to start filming the story?
Sure. Sorry. Yeah, I'll back that up. That's an important part of the process. So I made some phone calls just to the school and said, hey, I'm working on this film, and I explained the concept of it and all of that. And it got me to a few people, but I started to realize that, I spoke to the organizers of the event, right, the 50th anniversary committee, and they mentioned a few names here and there. And so I did have a name of a professor, I had a name of a college athlete who had been one of the guys who was shot, but he was not on the football team, but he was on the track team. He was the manager of the football team. Jordan Simmons was his name. Bill Hine, a professor at the school, who was kind of the in-house expert on the event, which coincidentally, this professor who's in the film, he's the white guy, the professor who's sitting in the library, if you remember seeing the film. Bill Hine had been at, this was the short version of the film, right? But Bill Hine had been at the Kent State massacre up in Ohio as well, or he was there later after Orangeburg, and it's one of the interesting points, and maybe we talked about this in the film. I can't remember everything that made the cut or not, but I had those two guys, and that was about it. But I needed to get down there. It was just, I should harken back to this because the combat camera side of my story. My combat camera unit that I spent 18 years at, 3 to 4 years on active duty and then 14 more in the reserves, is in Charleston, South Carolina, which isn't but like an hour and 15 minutes from Orangeburg. When I was doing some of my initial flight training to try to get into pilot training once I was on active duty, I used to fly in and out of their airport and do touch and goes from Charleston back. So I knew Orangeburg, and that had emphasized to me, AJ, like you, how could I not have heard about this? I lived there for a long time. How can something like this just be not known? It seems so fundamentally important. But South Carolina didn't, whomever there didn't, they weren't wearing that on their shirt sleeve. It was, people wanted that story to go. And so it seemed like I needed to go down there anyway. And I'm glad I did to the 50th. And I had said, hey, I'm going to bring a couple cameras, but I didn't have a funding commitment at that point. I knew I was out of pocket. So I called in a couple favors, brought in a crew from Atlanta that I know and have worked with. And I said, can you help me out, for a little bit less than normal? And and that guy brought his son who does some drone work. And so some of the stuff that you even see in the final film, we did shoot that very first time, but most of the interviews and most of the footage in the game was much later. Shot it over the course of maybe a year and a half, but
okay.
Those initial clearances. Normally, I'm not going to spend money or show up somewhere, particularly like on a more professionally budgeted something that's directly for a network coming from them, unless I know I have it all buttoned up. I try to shoot as few days as possible. And on this, it was one of those where I kind of knew I had to go. So was there for the 50th, and Jordan Simmons introduced me to his buddy, Jackie Kennerly. Here we are 50 years later. Jackie, talking to these guys as a white man, talking to these older Black gentlemen who have been through an experience like this, but it's not just that one time experience. They had lived their lives under the thumb of a system of systemic racism, where not only are you living through that, but you live through this moment where you're shot, you almost die, your town treats you like they don't really care too much that this has happened. The story is swept under the rug, and then nobody knows about it. So I think on one hand, they were grateful that somebody wanted to come tell the story, and there was a PBS documentary done a few years ago, but once again probably didn't get the attention it deserved. I don't know if enough people saw my film, but it was on national, and it's out there. But I think we need to keep telling a story. That's how we keep this alive. These guys didn't get justice, right? Jackie Kennerly, Dr. Cleveland Sellers, one of my personal heroes in life now, who was the man behind so many men, from Stokely Carmichael to Dr. King himself. He was there, and one of the kindest and most gracious human beings I'll ever meet. Let me come in and ask these questions, and they gave it all. I think on one hand, grateful that someone's here to help us continue to tell the story. Maybe that's some justice when the legal system provided none and still hasn't. I think, but also with great pain, because it brings up those memories of things. AJ, Jackie said to me, I couldn't talk about this until about 10 years ago. And I wouldn't have. It took him 40 years. Jackie, after he got shot and recovered, he got to go to Bengals training camp. He had an opportunity there, but then he got drafted into the Army and was shipped off to Vietnam. Wasn't able to get around the draft like maybe others of more privilege were able to. I won't mention anyone's name or indict anyone in that, but I think we all know that, there were ways around that, but Jackie didn't have that benefit. So it was a bit of a 1-2 punch for him. The Vietnam War was tough. Jackie carries those scars. And I think it's a dual-edged sword for guys like this telling their story. On one hand, yes, I want and need for this to be out there. Society needs to understand and hopefully learn and grow. Folks who don't know the story need to know it. But at the same time, just like any traumatic thing that happens in one's life, it stirred it all up, and I could see that these guys, it was tough, and I am grateful to them for helping me to gather and tell their story, hopefully in a way that is educational and informative, but powerful and transformative. It was for me, absolutely. And I hope for folks who see the film that it is as well. And you know, the sport of it, and the team is just the backdrop. But those guys are great. They have a group email that they send around. You know, we're not all that young, but the youngers than us, it's a group text, right? So these guys send out a group email. I'm on that email, which is, you know, so I get all this stuff back and forth. That team is tight. It was the team in the fall of '67 that was then, you know, so many of them, that was their senior year, some of them their junior year. That was that South Carolina State Bulldogs team, and they're still a pretty tight group. It's an honor and one of the privileges of my life to be included in so much of what's going on with that group when they talk to each other.